December 15th, 1944. The thermometer reads 12 degrees Fahrenheit. In a quickly made prisoner camp outside Munich, German women shook in worn-out dresses. Their breath turned into little clouds in the freezing air. Then something happened that would change everything they believed about their American guards. What happened next would not only save lives, but completely break apart everything both sides believed about their enemies. The German women had never imagined that the men they feared most would become their surprise heroes. Make sure you're subscribed because this story gets even more unbelievable. The camp itself was nothing more than quickly put up barbed wire fences around a group of wooden buildings that let cold in through every crack and opening. Originally designed to hold male prisoners of war, the place had been quickly changed when American forces began catching more and more German women who had worked in different jobs for the Reich. These weren't just random regular people caught in the fighting. Many were nurses who had worked in field hospitals, radio workers who had managed radio equipment, and support workers who had kept German military operations running behind the scenes. The women arrived at the camp wearing whatever they had on when captured. Some still wore the remains of their uniforms, now ripped and dirty from weeks of travel and processing through different holding centers. Others had been taken from their homes and wore simple dresses, many of which had seen better days even before the war began. None had been given proper winter clothing during their trip to this faraway place in the Bavarian countryside. Among the prisoners was Ingrid Müller, a 28-year-old former field nurse who held a thin wool shawl around her shoulders as she looked at her new surroundings. The shawl had been a gift from her mother before she left for service, and now it represented one of her few remaining connections to home. Next to her stood Maria Fischer, barely 19 years old, who had worked as a telegraph operator until American forces took over her position. Maria's dress was better suited for a summer picnic than a German winter, and she had already developed a constant cough during the trip to the camp. The American guards who watched over these prisoners were themselves far from home and dealing with the difficulties of running a place they had never been trained to operate. Sergeant Michael O'Connor from Boston had joined right after Pearl Harbor and had fought his way across Europe from Normandy to this frozen corner of Germany. He had seen enough fighting to last several lifetimes, but nothing had prepared him for the responsibility of watching over female prisoners of war, especially as winter got worse in the area. Private Tommy Williams, a farm boy from Iowa, had volunteered for the Army on his 18th birthday, driven by stories of German cruelty that had filled American newspapers for years. He had expected to find monsters when he met German prisoners. Instead, he found himself looking at women who reminded him of his own sister back home. Women who seemed just as cold, hungry, and scared as he often felt. The first interactions between guards and prisoners were marked by distrust on both sides and careful distance. The German women had been warned by their own propaganda that American soldiers were savage occupiers who showed no mercy to prisoners. They expected harsh treatment, not enough food, and possibly worse. Their experiences during transport had done little to prove these fears wrong, as overwhelmed American supplies had struggled to provide even basic necessities for the huge number of prisoners being taken as German resistance fell apart. For their part, the American soldiers had been repeatedly told about the dangers of becoming too friendly with enemy prisoners. Military rules demanded professional distance, and many soldiers felt genuine anger toward any German personnel after seeing the destruction and suffering caused by years of war. Some had lost close friends in battles against German forces, and forgiveness did not come easily in the bitter winter of 1944. Yet the physical reality of the camp made complete emotional distance nearly impossible. The buildings were overcrowded with women sleeping on thin straw mattresses that provided little protection from the wooden floors. Small children came with some of the prisoners, adding another layer of difficulty to an already tough situation. These children had committed no crimes beyond being born into wartime Germany, yet they shook in the same poor clothing as their mothers. As December went on and temperatures continued to drop, the human crisis became impossible to ignore. The approaching winter promised to be one of the harshest in recent memory, and the camp's heating systems were very inadequate for the number of people housed within its walls. What had seemed like a manageable situation during the relatively mild autumn months was quickly becoming a matter of life and death. The night of December 18th brought a weather system that weather experts would later describe as unprecedented in its harshness. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, and howling winds drove snow through every gap in the camp's hastily built buildings. The inadequate heating system, already struggling to warm the overcrowded buildings, began failing completely as coal supplies ran dangerously low. What had been uncomfortable living conditions changed overnight into a real survival crisis. Inside Barrack 7, Ingrid Müller wrapped her arms around 6-year-old Klaus, whose mother had died during an Allied bombing raid 3 weeks before capture. The boy had attached himself to Ingrid, and she had taken on the role of his protector despite having no legal responsibility to do so. Klaus's thin jacket, sized for a much smaller child, left his arms exposed to the bitter cold. His lips had taken on a bluish color that Ingrid recognized from her nursing experience as an early sign of hypothermia. Maria Fischer huddled in the corner with 3 other young women, all sharing a single blanket that provided little protection against the wind that whistled through gaps in the wooden walls. The constant cough she had developed during transport had gotten much worse, and she struggled to catch her breath between fits of violent shaking. Her summer dress, already not warm enough for normal winter conditions, offered virtually no protection against the Arctic conditions that had come to the camp. Throughout the buildings, similar scenes played out as mothers tried to shield their children with their own bodies. Elderly women doubled over in pain from the cold, and younger prisoners shared whatever little clothing they had. The sound of chattering teeth created a constant background rhythm broken up by the cries of babies who could not understand why they felt so uncomfortable and cold. Outside, Sergeant O'Connor made his required rounds, noting the frost that formed on his breath before it could disappear in the wind. His regulation winter coat, lined with wool and designed for exactly these conditions, kept him reasonably warm despite the brutal temperatures. As he passed each building, he could hear the sounds of distress from within, and the contrast between his own comfort and the suffering of the prisoners became increasingly difficult to accept. Private Williams went with the sergeant on his rounds, his own winter gear providing good protection against the weather. As they approached Barrack 7, they heard a sound that stopped both men in their tracks. It was Klaus crying, not just from cold, but from real fear, his young voice calling out for his mother in broken German phrases that needed no translation to understand their meaning. Through a crack in the wooden door, Williams caught a glimpse of Ingrid trying to warm the boy with her breath while wrapping him in her thin shawl. The uselessness of her efforts was obvious, even from a distance. The shawl, while precious to her emotionally, provided virtually no real protection against temperatures that were literally life-threatening. Klaus's crying had awakened other children in the building, and soon a chorus of distressed voices filled the night air. The 2 American soldiers exchanged glances that said more than words could express. Both men had younger siblings back home, and the sound of children in distress triggered protective instincts that went beyond nationality or military rules. O'Connor had received strict orders about keeping proper distance from prisoners, but those orders had been written by officers who had never stood outside a freezing building, listening to children cry from cold. Williams found himself thinking about his sister Emma, who was close to Klaus's age and probably sleeping safely in her warm bedroom back in Iowa at that very moment. The contrast between Emma's security and Klaus's suffering created a moral conflict that made following regulation rules increasingly difficult. Military training had prepared him for fighting against enemy soldiers, but nothing had prepared him for witnessing the suffering of innocent children who happened to be on the wrong side of a war they had not chosen. As the night went on and temperatures continued to drop, the situation inside the buildings got worse rapidly. Several elderly women had stopped shivering entirely, a dangerous sign that their bodies were no longer able to make heat. Young mothers held their babies against their skin, trying desperately to share whatever warmth they could produce. The thin walls of the buildings provided little barrier against wind that seemed determined to strip away every trace of warmth from the building. Medical supplies at the camp were limited under the best of circumstances, and treating hypothermia required resources that simply did not exist in adequate amounts. The camp's small medical room had been designed for minor injuries and routine medical needs, not for mass treatment of cold-related emergencies. Even if proper medical attention had been available, the basic problem remained: the lack of adequate clothing and heating to prevent the crisis from getting worse. By midnight, it became clear that without immediate action, The camp would likely experience its first cold-related deaths before dawn. The German female prisoners of war who had survived bombing raids, military defeats, and the chaos of capture now faced a different kind of battle against an enemy that showed no mercy and accepted no surrender. The bitter irony that they might die not from deliberate cruelty, but from simple exposure, was not lost on anyone who understood the seriousness of the situation developing in the frozen buildings. At 12:47 a.m., Sergeant O'Connor made a decision that would violate every regulation in the Army Handbook on prisoner management. Standing outside Barracks 7, listening to Klaus's increasingly weak cries, he began unbuttoning his regulation winter coat. The heavy wool piece of clothing issued specifically for European winter, fighting represented the difference between life and death in these conditions. Without it, O'Connor would face the same hypothermia risk as the prisoners he was supposed to guard. Private Williams watched in shocked silence as his sergeant removed the coat completely, revealing only the standard olive green uniform underneath. The wind immediately cut through the thinner fabric, and O'Connor's body began responding to the cold within seconds. His decision defied not only military rules, but basic survival instinct. Soldiers were specifically forbidden from giving personal equipment to prisoners, and giving away essential cold weather gear could be considered abandonment of duty, punishable by military court. O'Connor pushed open the door to Barracks 7, and the blast of cold air that escaped revealed the desperate conditions inside. Women looked up with a mixture of fear and confusion as the American sergeant entered their living space, something that had never happened before during night hours. Ingrid instinctively pulled Klaus closer, uncertain whether this unexpected visit would bring help or additional hardship. Without speaking, O'Connor approached Ingrid and the shivering child. Klaus looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for his 6 years, eyes that had already seen more suffering than most people experience in a lifetime. The sergeant knelt down and gently wrapped his winter coat around both Ingrid and Klaus, making sure that the boy was completely covered in the warm wool lining that still held O'Connor's body heat. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Klaus's violent shaking began to calm down within minutes, and his breathing became more regular as his small body started to warm. Ingrid felt tears forming in her eyes, not from cold, but from an emotion she had not expected to feel toward an American soldier. The kindness of the gesture was so unexpected, so opposite to everything she had been told about her captors, that it completely challenged her understanding of the situation. Other women in the building watched this scene unfold with amazement and disbelief. Maria Fischer, still coughing from her corner, stared in shock as the enemy soldier gave up his own protection to help a German child. The propaganda they had been fed about American cruelty seemed impossible to match with the reality of what they were seeing. This man, who could have remained warm and safe outside, had willingly exposed himself to possibly deadly cold to help someone he had been trained to see as an enemy. Williams, still standing in the doorway, realized that his sergeant's action had created an expectation that could not be ignored. Other children in the building were looking at him with the same desperate hope that Klaus had shown, and the private found himself facing the same moral choice that had driven O'Connor's decision. His own winter coat, slightly smaller but equally warm, represented his protection against the brutal night that still had hours remaining. The moment of decision came when Williams noticed a woman in the far corner holding a baby who had stopped crying completely. In his experience helping with farm animals back in Iowa, he knew that silence from a baby in distress often meant a dangerous condition. The baby's stillness was not peaceful sleep, but the lethargy that came with severe hypothermia in the very young. Williams removed his coat without hesitation, crossing the building to reach the woman with the baby. She looked up at him with eyes filled with desperation and gratitude, understanding his intention even before he wrapped the warm piece of clothing around her and the baby. The coat's leftover body heat immediately began working to reverse the baby's dangerous condition, and within minutes the child began to show signs of renewed alertness. The two American soldiers now stood in the freezing building, wearing only their standard uniforms, exposed to the same life-threatening conditions as the prisoners they were supposed to guard. Their sacrifice was witnessed by more than 30 German women and children, all of whom had been trained to expect cruelty from their captors. Instead, they were seeing something that challenged every assumption they had held about the nature of their enemies. Word of what was happening in Barracks 7 began to spread quietly through the camp as other guards completed their rounds and discovered O'Connor and Williams inside the prisoner quarters. The sight of two American soldiers sharing the same dangerous conditions as their charges created a ripple of confusion and debate among the remaining guard staff. Some viewed the action as dangerously naive and possibly rebellious, while others found themselves questioning their own commitment to strict rule enforcement. Corporal Jake Morrison from Detroit had been planning to report the unauthorized entry into prisoner quarters when he first discovered the situation. However, seeing Klaus sleeping peacefully in O'Connor's coat and witnessing the grateful tears of German mothers changed his view entirely. Morrison began to consider his own winter gear and the children in other buildings who were facing the same life-threatening conditions. The night was far from over, and temperatures showed no signs of improving. The decision made by O'Connor and Williams had saved immediate lives, but it had also created an example that would test the moral courage of every American soldier in the camp. The question was no longer whether regulations allowed such actions, but whether human decency demanded them, regardless of military rules. Within 30 minutes of O'Connor and Williams entering Barrack 7, the story of their sacrifice had spread through the guard rotation like wildfire. Corporal Morrison found himself unable to complete his rounds without stopping at Barrack 12, where he could hear the distressed cries of more children echoing through the thin walls. Inside, he found mothers desperately trying to shield their young ones from the killing cold, using nothing but summer clothing and worn-out blankets. What Morrison witnessed changed him instantly. A young German mother was breathing warm air onto her toddler's hands in a useless attempt to prevent frostbite. The child's fingers had already taken on the waxy, pale appearance that Morrison recognized as the early stages of serious cold injury. Without thinking about it, Morrison began removing his own winter coat, his hands moving faster than his mind could process what it meant. The German women in Barrack 12 reacted with shocked disbelief. They had spent months being told that American soldiers were monsters who enjoyed German suffering. Yet here was another enemy soldier willingly exposing himself to deadly danger to protect German children. The mental confusion was overwhelming, forcing these women to face the possibility that everything they had believed about their captors might be completely wrong. Private First Class Robert Chen found himself outside Barrack 15, wrestling with his own moral crisis. Chen had volunteered for military service, partly to prove his American loyalty, and following regulations had always been his path to acceptance. Yet the sounds coming from the building made regulation compliance seem not just wrong, but evil. Inside, Chen discovered Greta Hoffmann, a 45-year-old former hospital administrator, trying to care for 8 children whose mothers had been separated during processing. Greta had managed to gather all the children into a tight group, using her own body and thin scarves to create a makeshift shelter. Her lips were blue from cold, and her movements had become slow in a way that Chen recognized as dangerous hypothermia symptoms. The sight of Greta giving up her own well-being to protect children who were not even her own broke through Chen's careful following of military rules. He removed his winter coat and helped Greta wrap the children in its warmth, watching as their violent shaking began to calm down. Greta looked up at Chen with an expression of deep gratitude that went beyond language barriers entirely. As more American soldiers made similar choices throughout the night, the atmosphere within the camp went through a basic transformation. German women who had spent weeks avoiding eye contact with their guards suddenly found themselves sharing life-saving warmth provided by those same guards. The artificial barriers created by war, propaganda, and military hierarchy began crumbling under the weight of shared humanity. The response from the German female prisoners of war was as unexpected as the soldiers' actions. Instead of viewing the American sacrifice as weakness to be exploited, the women began organizing themselves to make sure that the borrowed coats provided maximum benefit. Ingrid, with her nursing background, took charge of watching the most vulnerable children and rotating the warm coats to prevent anyone from dying of hypothermia. Maria Fischer, despite her own constant cough, began teaching other women breathing exercises that could help generate body heat. The irony that former enemies were now working together for mutual survival was not lost on anyone involved. The most profound change occurred in the children themselves. Klaus, warm and safe in Sergeant O'Connor's coat, began speaking to the American soldier in the few English words he had learned. His innocent attempts at communication created moments of connection that went beyond the artificial divisions of wartime. Other children followed Klaus's example. carefully approaching American soldiers who had shared their warmth. News of the night's events reached Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, who faced an unprecedented crisis of military discipline. His soldiers had violated clear orders and possibly put their own safety at risk. According to military law, Patterson should have ordered military court proceedings. Yet Patterson also understood that his soldiers had prevented multiple deaths and that forcing hypothermic children to return life-saving coats would basically be murder. By dawn on December 19th, word of the American soldiers' unprecedented actions had reached every corner of the camp, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate crisis of the brutal winter night. The surviving German female prisoners of war found themselves completely reassessing everything they had believed about their captors, while the American soldiers discovered that their individual acts of conscience had together transformed the entire atmosphere of the place. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's morning inspection revealed a scene that defied every principle of traditional prisoner management. In Barracks 7, he found Sergeant O'Connor sitting beside Klaus, both sharing the warmth of the returned coat, while O'Connor taught the German boy to count in English. The sight of an American non-commissioned officer willingly spending off-duty time with an enemy child challenged Patterson's understanding of proper military conduct. Yet the obvious bond between the two made any intervention seem cruel rather than necessary. The transformation was equally clear in the other buildings, where coats had been shared during the night. German women who had previously cowered when American soldiers approached now greeted their protectors with cautious smiles and attempts at English conversation. Maria Fischer had begun teaching basic German phrases to Private Williams, creating an informal language exchange that violated numerous regulations about becoming too friendly with enemy personnel. More significantly, the crisis had revealed organizational abilities among the German female prisoners of war that camp administration had never recognized or used. Under Ingrid's informal leadership, the women had set up a medical sorting system for watching hypothermia symptoms and giving out warm clothing to those most at risk. Their efficiency in managing limited resources impressed even veteran soldiers who had witnessed military supply operations across Europe. Greta Hoffmann had emerged as another unexpected leader, organizing educational activities for the children that kept them busy and helped generate body heat through movement. Her background in hospital administration proved invaluable in creating systems for shared childcare, meal distribution, and basic sanitation that actually improved camp conditions for everyone. The most remarkable development was the emergence of team projects between guards and prisoners that served mutual interests. Chen discovered that several of the German women had technical skills that could fix persistent problems with the camp's heating system. Despite regulations forbidding prisoners from accessing mechanical equipment, Patterson found himself allowing their involvement when the alternative was continued life-threatening conditions. Working together, American soldiers and German female prisoners of war managed to improve the heating efficiency by nearly 40% within 3 days. The technical knowledge came from women who had worked in German factories and military installations, while the Americans provided tools and materials. The success of this cooperation suggested possibilities for cooperation that military rules had never considered. The changes extended beyond practical improvements to include basic shifts in daily interactions throughout the camp. American guards began learning the names of individual prisoners rather than simply referring to them by building numbers. German women started volunteering information about security concerns before they grew into crisis. The opposing relationship that had characterized the camp's early months gradually gave way to something resembling a working community cooperation. These developments did not occur without resistance from both sides. Some American soldiers viewed the growing familiarity as dangerous softness that could compromise security. Similarly, some German women struggled with feelings of guilt and betrayal as they found themselves genuinely caring about the welfare of soldiers they had been taught to hate. Yet the practical benefits proved impossible to ignore. Camp incidents decreased dramatically as mutual respect replaced mutual suspicion. Health conditions improved not only because of better heating, but because German medical personnel began providing voluntary help with health care for both prisoners and guards. Perhaps most importantly, the children in the camp began showing signs of psychological recovery that surprised everyone involved. The winter of 1944 eventually gave way to spring, but the bonds formed during that bitter December night proved more lasting than the season itself. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany and the war moved toward its inevitable end, the small prisoner camp outside Munich became an unlikely model for humanitarian prisoner management that would influence post-war policies for decades to come. Klaus celebrated his 7th birthday in April 1945 with a party organized together by Ingrid and Sergeant O'Connor. The celebration featured a cake made from Red Cross supplies and decorations made by other German women in the camp, while American soldiers contributed candy and small toys sent from families back home. The image of former enemies singing Happy Birthday in 2 languages captured the extraordinary transformation that had occurred within the camp's barbed wire boundaries. The formal end of the war in May 1945 brought new challenges as the camp changed from housing prisoners of war to managing displaced persons waiting for return home. Many of the German women expressed reluctance to leave the security and community they had found within the camp, while American soldiers faced the reality of permanent separation from people who had become friends rather than mere charges under their supervision. Ingrid Müller made the decision to move to the United States after the war, sponsored by Sergeant O'Connor's family in Boston. Her nursing credentials, combined with glowing recommendations from American medical personnel who had worked with her during the camp's final months, enabled her transition to civilian life in America. Klaus went with her as her adopted son, and both maintained lifelong correspondence with O'Connor and his family. Maria Fischer returned to Germany, but continued exchanging letters with Private Williams until his death in 1987. Their correspondence, preserved in the Williams family archives, documented the rebuilding of post-war Germany through the eyes of someone who had experienced American kindness during her darkest hour. Maria eventually became a teacher, dedicating her career to promoting international understanding and cultural exchange between former enemy nations. The heating system improvements pioneered through American-German cooperation in the camp became a model for similar projects in other displaced persons facilities throughout occupied Germany. The technical innovations born from necessity and cooperation across enemy lines showed that practical problem-solving could go beyond political and cultural barriers when human welfare was at stake. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson's detailed reports about the camp's transformation influenced Allied policy regarding prisoner and displaced person management throughout the remainder of the occupation period. His documentation of how humanitarian treatment actually improves security and efficiency challenged traditional military approaches to dealing with former enemy populations. Patterson later served as an advisor during the development of the Geneva Conventions, bringing first-hand experience of successful prisoner management to international humanitarian law discussions. The children who had been saved by American winter coats grew up to become teachers, doctors, engineers, and community leaders who carried memories of kindness across enemy lines throughout their lives. Klaus became a doctor specializing in children's care, often telling colleagues that his career choice was inspired by watching adults from different nations work together to protect vulnerable children during wartime. Several of the American soldiers involved in that December night's events kept in touch with the German families they had helped long after returning to the United States. These relationships evolved into cultural exchange programs, student exchanges, and business partnerships that showed how individual acts of compassion could create lasting bridges between nations that had been bitter enemies. Private Chen's decision to share his coat despite facing discrimination within American ranks became part of his family's immigration story, passed down through generations as an example of how moral courage could go beyond personal suffering. His descendants established a scholarship fund for international students studying conflict resolution, specifically honoring individuals who showed compassion across cultural and political divides. The buildings where coats were shared were eventually torn down as the camp changed to other uses, but photographs and testimonials preserved the memory of those crucial nights. These documents became part of historical archives documenting the complexity of human relationships during wartime, showing how individual choices could create pockets of humanity within the broader context of international conflict. Modern historians studying the camp's records have noted that the winter coat incident marked a turning point not only in prisoner-guard relationships, but in broader Allied approaches to post-war rebuilding and reconciliation. The successful cooperation between former enemies at the individual level provided evidence that larger-scale reconciliation efforts could succeed if built on foundations of mutual respect and shared humanity. The legacy of that frozen December night extends beyond the specific individuals who experienced it to influence modern discussions about humanitarian treatment during conflict, prisoner rights, and the potential for reconciliation between opposing groups. Military academies now study the camp's transformation as an example of how following humanitarian principles can actually enhance rather than compromise security objectives. Perhaps most importantly, the story shows that even in the darkest circumstances of international conflict, individual acts of kindness can create ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate impact. The decision of a few American soldiers to share their winter coats with German female prisoners of war saved lives in the moment, but it also planted seeds of understanding that continued growing long after the last shot of World War II had been fired. The children who were kept warm by enemy coats grew up in a world where former enemies became allies, where international cooperation replaced international conflict, and where the lessons learned in a small prisoner camp contributed to a broader understanding that shared humanity goes beyond the artificial divisions created by war. Their story reminds us that compassion once offered across enemy lines has the power to reshape not only individual relationships, but the entire path of international relations for generations to come.